Hello everyone, my name is Andrey. Today we continue learning Python, and today we'll talk about static methods and static variables in Python object-oriented programming. So let's start. Once again, today we'll talk about static methods and static variables in Python OOP or object-oriented programming. So we'll explain what are those, or I'll explain what are those, how to use them, and let's just start. Before you watch that video, you need to know what are classes, what is constructor, destructor, so all of that stuff that we talked about in the previous two videos of that series. Okay, so imagine that you have a class, for example, human, class human, and once again, human is like just a class for every person. So me, you, your friend, your mother, your father, everyone is a realization, so an object of that class human. And imagine that every person knows exactly how many people there are on the planet Earth. So for example, I can say the number like 7 billion people or 5 people or 4 people who live right now on that planet, and what we need to do if we want to realize that in our Python. So what we need to do is have some way of some counter that will increase when we have people, so when we create people, and that will decrease when we remove people, so when we delete people. Yeah, that kind of sounds bad, but whatever. So in order to create that counter, we need to use human count, which is 0 by default, and that human count is just a variable right now. But once again, today we'll talk about static variables and static methods. So as you may guess, we will start with static variables. So what are those? When we're talking about any variable in any class, in any object, we're talking about a variable that is being used within an object. So let me just create. That was a very, very strange sentence, but imagine that we have a class. So in our case, it will be that rectangle. Our rectangle, which is our class, like that. And we also have an object, so realization of that class. We get that circle, and we create our object from that class. So we create it somewhere here, and that is our object. And imagine that we also have human count here, or imagine that instead of human count we have variable x as 0. So in our class we have x as 0, and when we create that object, so when we create our obj, we copy that variable and we place it in our object. And you know that when I'm saying like human1 equals human, so I create an object, and if I say human1.x, or if I say inside of function func self return self.x, what I'm actually doing with that x is I use that specific x, so the one that I marked right here. So I use x inside of my object. So what does that mean? When I'm using human1.x, I literally call get me, or I literally use that code that says get me my x variable from my human object. So I'm saying get me that specific variable, that one, not that one, but that one for a specific object. If you have another object somewhere here, I'm not calling anything to get my variable x from that object. I'm getting the value specifically from that obj. Okay, but if I'm saying define function self and return self x, I explained that in the previous video and in the video before it, and self x is just a variable that points to the object itself. So what we have here is return self x. If I'm calling like my function from human, as you can see I'm calling it from human, then self is a human, and I'm also going to get that x as 0. But what if you have a very complex task, once again human counter, and we need to somehow execute it? So human counter, so we have human count, which is 0 by default. And if I want to have a way to get a variable that is placed somewhere in the in any other scope, not in my object, because if I'm always calling my x that value, so if I'm always using that value as my variable, then what if I have two objects? So once again, our task is as follows. We need to have a class that has a counter of each object, and every object knows what is the counter. Once again, if I'm saying like it can be 10, if I'm saying like self x from that, we'll always call variables inside of objects. So why is that? Because when we're talking about self x or normal variables, normal properties of objects, we're talking about properties that are being called from objects. So if I'm saying, once again, human1 equals human, and I'm saying human1.humanCount, what I'm doing here is I'm calling that variable from an object. But static variables are variables that are being called from the class. So instead of using human1, what I can actually do is use human.humanCount. So you see what I'm doing right here? I'm using human.humanCount. I don't use object human, I'm using like the class. So that is the class, as you can probably see, and I'm using the dot notation to get that specific human count. If I'm gonna print it, we will have no problems with that. So I receive 0, everything is normal. If I'm gonna say like human count equals 10, and let me just move my print somewhere here, as you can see, everything is alright with that variable. So what am I actually doing here? I'm using a static variable in Python. So we don't really have static variables in Python, because if you work with other languages, then you know that there is a way of describing static variable in every language. So what you are going to do in almost every programming language is use static human count, for example. But in Python, we don't have that. And if I'm saying what that variable is it static? Is it a normal variable? You can't really say. So why is that? Because once again, static variable is a variable that is related not related to an object. It's related to the class. So we don't have an object that contains our variable. We have a class that contains our variable. But actually in Python we don't really have like built-in static variables. But we can use some tricks of that language to achieve the same results with just normal variables. So what I'm doing right here is I'm saying that you need to call human count and assign 10 as a value for that variable. And you need to use human as a reference. So you need to use human class as a reference. So what am I saying is that human class will have human count variable as 10. I can do that in Python, and because of that we have static variables. So once again, we call that variable not from an object but from a class. And what is the difference? The main difference is that if I'm just gonna delete it and put everything once again, so let me just put class somewhere here and object somewhere here, object somewhere here. So if I'm saying it like human.humanCount, let me just write x, so x is the same as human count. I'm saying that you don't need to call the variable that is inside of my object. You don't need to call that at all. So let me just put it, mark it in red. You don't need to call that at all. You need to call that specific variable. So you need to call that one. And because of that, what we can actually achieve is if every object of our class and every part of our system calls that human count variable from our class, then what are we saying? Is we're saying, for example, object 1 call that variable, object 2 call that variable, object 3 call that variable. So as you can see, we use the same variable and we use it from a class. So that way we can achieve static variables, because once again, we don't reference an object as our first part of that expression. We are reference the class, and because of that our variable is related to the class. But actually, once again, in Python don't have static variables as a built-in feature. That is just an imitation of static variables. It's a very great imitation. We don't have any limitations, but still it's an imitation. And because of that, what we have is just an imitation, but it works perfectly fine. So once again, static variable is a variable that you reference from a class, not from an object. And that is very, very important, because there are some tasks that can only be achieved with static variables. For example, human count. Now let's make it a static variable, and let's complete our program with our human count, which increases every time we create our object. As you already know, we have init, and we can use plus equals 1, and as you already know, we have delete. And what we can do here is use self human count minus equals 1. And now what I'm gonna do is create, for example, 5 people. Let me just do it like that. Human 2, human 3, human 4, human 5. And what I can do right now is call my human count variable, run it like that, and as you can see it says 0. So why is that? Let me just, it says 0 because, as you can see, I did not use my variable as a static one. So whenever you put self, you don't use your variable as a static one. What you need to do is put human.humanCount. That is very, very important. So that variable is a static is a static property right now. Let's run it, and as you can see, now everything is alright, we have 5. But let me just delete some people. So human 1, human 3. Let me run it, and as you can see, we received 3 because we deleted 2 people and we decreased our human count variable. So once again, what was the problem? We used self, and whenever you use self, you reference an object. But with every static variable, what you need to do is use human.human count. And actually, it's very, very important because, as I said, we don't have a real static variable in Python. We only have an imitation of that static variable. So what does that mean? That means that for every object, you still can use your x value. So every object still has that x value inside of it. So x here, and x somewhere here. But actually, whenever we talk about static variables, what we can't do is use them with both static notation and object notation. So object notation is when you use like self human count. Why is that? Because it's very, very confusing for other programmers. It is broken. So when you use human.human count, so if you want to use your variable as a static one, do it all the time. If you want to use your variable as a normal one, do it all the time as well, because you don't want to mix those ideas up. Once again, it's an imitation, and all the programmers will understand that, okay, that variable is a static one. But if you mix them up, then it will be really, really complicated for others to follow your code, and it will be very complicated for you to get it as well, because you only want to stick up with one of those. And of course, static variable is not as important as the normal one, but still it's very, very crucial idea in every object-oriented programming language. So now, as you can see, we are using our static variable because we call it from our class. And now once again, what's the idea is that I have all of the variables inside of my classes, but I don't use them. So I don't use that x, I don't use that x, I don't use that x. Where is my pointer? I don't use that x, and I don't use that x. Instead of that, I'm saying that all of my objects should use that x. So you use that, you use that, you use that. And as you can see, that x that I'm pointing to is located inside of a class. So that is why we have a static variable. And that is the whole idea. So now let's talk about static methods. And I think that you already know what are those. So static methods are functions that are related to a class, not to an object. So let me just create any function, func. And as you can see, one parameter that we use in every function is self. So once again, self is a link to the object itself. When we using human1 equals human1 dot func, you're using self as human1. So human1 is self in our case. What I can do is print self. I just can print self, and we will see that we have human object at some address. So whenever we call a function, our self is that human. But if we're talking about static method and how we can create static methods in Python, is what we can do is use that sign. I forgot what the name of that sign is, and we can also use static method. So we can use decorator static method, and that way what we can emit is that self, because static methods are just normal functions in objects or in classes, sorry. And we can't reference self because we don't reference any objects, because function once again is a static method, and we need to call it from our human class. We can also call it from our human object, but it's up to you. Right now it's up to you. With static variables, what you need to do is stick up to one. You can't use normal variables and static variables in a mix. But with static variables, with static methods, what you need to do is you either need to call them from your class or from your object. It doesn't really matter, but typically if you want to use your variable or your function as a static method, you will find yourself using it from a class. Because why do you need to use static method if you want to use your function from an object? But still it's fine to do that, but what you need to remember is that if you use your static method, then you cannot reference self, because even if you put self right here, you need to provide it as a normal variable, because once again, static method is just a function inside of a class. And yeah, so that is the whole idea. Static method once again is a function that is related to the class, so the same idea as it is with properties, but the only difference is that we don't use self once again because we don't reference it from an object, but we reference it from the class. And yeah, that's the whole idea. Static methods can be really useful if you want to somehow aggregate all of your functions into one class. So very often it's very useful to have a class, for example calculator, that will have your static methods in one place. So sum, and you get x, y, then you return x plus y, then you have your static method as divide, for example, you get x, y, you return x divided by y, and as you can see right now what I'm doing is I'm creating all of those functions as static methods, and I can use calculator.sum, divide, and some other stuff. So that is very useful, and that is one pattern of applying static methods. Another one is, yeah, it's just a method that you want to use when you don't want to reference an object but rather want to reference a class. And that is the whole idea of static methods and static functions. So once again, in Python we don't really have static variables because we use an imitation of them. And with static methods it's really interesting because we have a decorator, and once again static method, that class, I think, yeah, it's a class, static method is a decorator, but you always want to apply it whenever you want to create static method. But with static functions we don't have those. You just reference your object from, or with static variables, sorry, we don't have those in our language, so we don't have built-in static variables in Python. And because of those, whenever you use your static variables, what you need to do is either reference your class, human dot something, or class dot something, or you don't want to use static variables at all. So once again, that is very important. That is the whole idea, that static variables and static methods are the variables and the methods, so functions which are being called from the class rather from an object. And that is the whole idea. So thank you for the watching, subscribe to my channel, leave a like, and good luck.